So back in the day when I started as a part-time government grant manager for a nonprofit, we used to have a lot of big white binders. Do you remember those? For those of you who's been around for some time, remember those big white binders or big black binders, whatever color? Welcome back to another episode of Federal Grants Explained, a podcast created to explain what's happening in the world of federal grants. My name is Patrice Davis. I'm the founder and CEO of GrantWin Consulting, formerly GrantsWorks. We're a federal grant consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia, and we support organizations such as nonprofits, colleges and universities, local and state government agencies, and yes, for-profit commercial organizations. We support them as they find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal and other grants. So while most of our episodes have been focused on what's happening at the federal agency level or happening around the federal government, I actually specialize in federal grant compliance. I speak, train, and write about federal grant compliance best practices, about when things go wrong, and I try to connect the dots between federal grant funding and the positive impact federal grants can have on people and communities. I have over 20 years of experience obtaining and managing federal grants, and I'm one of about 350 or so, or 300 or so certified grant management specialists in the country. Hey there, good looking people. It's your girl, Patrice, and I am the founder and CEO of GrantsWorks. I'm stopping by this morning to talk to you about something that's really important, and that is the difference between grants from a family or corporate foundation versus a government grant. So government grants, the most important thing to remember is that they are taxpayer dollars. So that in and of itself takes it up a notch. So whether you have a grant from a foundation or from a government agency, you need to make sure that you have financial management and data management systems in place so you can actually justify what you're doing with those grant funds. So you should not be managing your grant budget in an Excel spreadsheet. You need to have a system where you can actually enter in the budget of that grant award by line item so that you can actually run regular reports, budget to actual reports showing how much you received and how much expenses were actually charged to that grant. You also want to make sure that you're not doing what? Charging funds for grant A to grant B. That's called commingling. So I also want to talk about the second difference between foundation grants and government grants: training. In 15 years, I learned everything I learned about government grants because I worked for small nonprofits, large nonprofits. I worked at a research university that received hundreds of millions of dollars in government grants. And I was a senior director of federal grants for a large nonprofit organization that many of you have heard about. So that was 15 years. In order to accelerate your understanding of government grants, you're going to have to do training. I took training in every aspect of my career at different organizations, from a lot of different training organizations. GrantsWorks offers training on grantsworksacademy.com. You can actually access it via the link in bio. So don't sleep on the training. Don't think the information is just going to show up in your brain. Don't struggle through it. Just take the training, whether it's my training or another company's training. You cannot take government grants and treat them like foundation grants. You're going to have to get training to understand how to manage them so that you are ready for audits, you're compliant, and you don't get in trouble. All right? Thank you. Today, we're exploring a topic some of you may find super interesting and others may not find so interesting. However, if your organization has a federal grant and you've spent at least $1 million in federal grant or federal cooperative agreement funding, this applies to your organization. And that topic is the single audit. So I know when people hear the word audit, obviously it doesn't, make them feel nice and, gushy inside. It's probably something that they, would rather not experience. But I'm going to try to make this as pleasant as possible. And I'm going to speak around the edges of the single audit and the single audit process. I'm not going to go into, some of the details such as the auditee's responsibilities, the auditor's responsibilities. I'm not going to take a deep dive into the compliance supplement, which I have in the past, or any of those really specific details. The purpose really is to provide an overview of the single audit and then talk a little bit about what an organization can do to be as ready as possible for a single audit. But we're going to take the context is really going to be around how being, effective federal grant managers or effective at your federal grant management helps you prepare for your audit. We call it single audit readiness. So again, I know it's not the sexiest topic in the world, but we're going to, again, take a different look at it. In November 2025, I led a session at the Grant Professionals Association Grant Summit, and the session title was about alleviating audit anxiety through effective federal grant management. And I realize that's easier said than done for some organizations, depending, of course, on their size, organizational infrastructure, whether it's centralized versus non-centralized grant teams. If they have grant teams, sometimes they don't have grant teams. Sometimes they don't have grant teams. Really large organizations, they have program, they have finance, but and then it also depends how much training and professional development their teams have received, turnover rate, all kinds of things, right? So I know it's easier said than done. But that is what we're going to touch on. And I mean, again, touch on it. I'm not going into the regulatory requirements in Subpart F. I'm not going to, again, take that deep dive into the 2025 Compliance Supplement. All right. So, by the way, as I always say, a lot of federal grant compliance rests on being able to support not just your compliance with program requirements, but certainly the cost charged to a federal grant. And so I am giving away the supporting documentation and cost allowability primer for federal grantees. You can either just add the word primer in the comments below, or you can grab it using the link in the video description. We do, I do want to point out we have a primer, which is an overview of supporting documentation or adequate documentation and cost allowability, what that means. But then we also have an actual checklist that we created for federal grantees. And it's literally, a really, really, really good checklist that your organization can use to make sure that you have adequate documentation for cost charged to federal grants. So back to why we're here. I'll first start with a brief overview of federal grant audit requirements. So back in the day when I started as a part-time government grant manager for a nonprofit, we used to have a lot of big white binders. Do you remember those? For those of you who's been around for some time, remember those big white binders or big black binders, whatever color? Everything was in big binders those days. But on the side of one of those binders was A133. A133 was one of the 8 OMB circulars. Back then, a single audit was called an A133 audit. So there were other circulars, A110, A122, A87, I believe. And a lot of those circulars were, federal grant requirements depending on the type of entity you were. So institutions of higher ed had their own, then, nonprofits had their own. Then the A133 were the audit requirements for multiple types of entities. They were all in separate, different, OMB circulars. And that's why part of the reason why uniform guidance is called uniform guidance. It is the Office of Management and Budget deciding, I don't know when they decided to do it, but I know that they released the initial draft in 2013, and then what they call the, the final draft. It wasn't really the final. It's a preliminary final or some odd term that they use back in December 2014. So uniform guidance has been around for almost 12 years. So before then, they were all separate circulars. A133 was one of them. So we took a little detour there to provide some insight into that. So unfortunately, there are still some auditors, though, and I've seen it, that call it an A133 audit, even though the name changed back, 15 years ago or thereabouts. So if you hear that term, that's what it is. A single audit is defined, and I use the Treasury Department's definition this time, by the Treasury Department as, quote, a rigorous organization-wide financial and compliance examination required for non-federal entities such as states, local governments, nonprofits, and institutions of higher education that expend $1 million or more in federal grants within its fiscal year. They actually have the incorrect amount because they just haven't updated the threshold yet. They have $750,000, but it's actually now $1 million or more expended within the organization's fiscal year, not in the federal fiscal year, in your organization's federal fiscal year. So your fiscal year may be, July to June. Another organization's fiscal year may be January to December. So if you expend $1 million or more of federal grants or cooperative agreement funding within that year, then you are required to have a single audit. And that's not just $1 million from a single grant. If you have 5 grants and 2 are directly from a federal agency and 2 are they're subawarded from a state agency or another pass-through entity. Just bottom line is if you spend $1 million or more across the different sources and the funding is federal, the funding source is federal, and it's a grant or cooperative agreement or some other kind of financial assistance, then yes, your organization is required to have a single audit. So the purpose of the single audit is to, quote, ensure proper use. They have usage. I don't want to use the word usage. Ensure proper use of federal funds as it focuses on internal controls, compliance with program requirements, among other things. So again, during a single audit, auditors are looking at, 1, financial statements. Not just the financials, but they're looking at policies. Do they exist? Documentation. Do they exist? And a system of internal controls. Do they exist? And they absolutely should. And they're also looking at 2, programmatic compliance evaluation. You're probably like, well, what does that mean? That means that federal grants are typically, attached to a program that the federal government decided to establish. And those programs have certain programmatic requirements. For example, the MICV program, Maternal and Infant. Oh my God, I forgot what MICV stands for. Home visiting program. I don't remember what it is, but MICV is a program that is administered by the Health Resources and Services Administration, I believe. And so there are certain requirements that, recipients of federal grants of the MICV program from the MICV program have to adhere to. And some of them are very interesting, but I'll leave that there. But I did want to give you an idea of what that means, programmatic compliance, complying with the specifics of that particular program. Okay. So what is the purpose of the single audit? So the single audit, the purpose is to assess whether the federal grantee has a viable financial management system with adequate internal controls, that they have, quote, fairly presented financial statements prepared in compliance with GAAP, which is the generally accepted accounting principles. Wow. If the grantee's financial, cash, and other reports or reimbursements are based on accurate financial data, and if the grantee used federal funds as required per the award terms and conditions, federal law, or federal regulations, and again, specific program requirements. So that keeps coming back up. It goes to show that, yes, programmatically, there are some things that need to be in place, right? But there are also some things that need to be in place financially. So programmatically means, yes, are you meeting the performance objectives? But there are also, program restrictions, certain things around compliance with programmatic requirements, not just did you, carry out the program, achieve the performance objectives, and then were able to provide me with a proper programmatic report. There's some program requirements in many instances as well. So I'll pause there. And I do also want to talk a little bit about a compliance supplement. So a compliance supplement, this is something that many grantees may not be aware of. And it's that the Office of Management and Budget, again, let's use the acronym OMB, publishes something called a compliance supplement each year. They're supposed to publish it by a certain time of the year because it's used by independent auditors who conduct single audits. And so they're waiting for this compliance supplement, and sometimes, they're late. They use the compliance supplement to get direction or guidance on which 6 of the 12 compliance requirements, for every major program they need to focus their testing on, and actually how to test them. And this way, auditors get to focus a little bit more on the programs included in the program and the compliance supplement. They get to dig a little bit deeper rather than covering all 12 compliance requirements for certain major programs. They get to identify which 6, how to test those 6, and again, additional guidance from the Office of Management and Budget. Now, I have actually read through a certain portion of a compliance supplement many years ago. I believe there's an executive summary, and it's a really big document. I wouldn't sit down and read it for fun, but I did actually kind of enjoy reading, some of the programs that I'm familiar with. Again, there are thousands of programs that are administered by federal agencies and from which federal grants are awarded, right? So obviously not every single program is in the compliance supplement. But the program, there were a couple of programs I was familiar with, and it was interesting to see the way that they instructed auditors to, test how well a federal grantee was adhering to the requirements of that particular program. So, if you're ever, just interested in taking a look, find that 2025 compliance supplement that was released November of last year and have at it. Again, it was released November 2025. It was about 6 months late, but it's out there. And, we can all kind of wonder when we expect to see the 2026 compliance supplement. So I'm going to share a little bit about my experience with single audits. I just wanted to, again, make sure you guys were aware of what they were. I'll provide a teeny bit of my experience with single audits. So first of all, I am not an auditor. I don't play one on TV, and I have a lot of respect for auditors. I see them as a kindred spirit, brethren of some sort. They're sort of like a kindred brethren or sistren in a larger goal of effective stewardship of federal funds. So absolutely respect auditors and the amazing work that they do. I've been in positions, though, where I was the primary federal grant contact for auditors during a single audit. So that means they're sitting in my office, across from me, my desk, asking me for a gazillion supporting documents for this cost or for that cost. And because of the way we did things, finding that cost wasn't the problem. I didn't have binders still at that time, but we definitely made sure that we maintained documentation. By that time, the organization I was working with had a pretty substantive, accounts payable system. I had access to certain modules. I was able to review expenses submitted. By the way, in one of my roles, my job was, as program managers, we're submitting expenses, whether they're travel expenses, whatever it was that we're going to be charged to the federal grant. My job was to review every single expense, review all of the supporting documentation, decline if the documentation wasn't adequate. Obviously accept it if it was adequate and supported the cost properly. And that's part of the reason why I'm always talking about adequate documentation, supporting documentation. I'm that girl, right? I'm that girl that used to just really review quite a bit of those things. So I think I've just been trained to always think about that. So again, that means they're sitting in my office across from me asking about supporting documentation for this cost and that cost, or proof of FFATA reporting. FFATA means the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act. I believe that's what it stands for. It's been a while. Proof of FFATA reporting for this or that subrecipient. And then, maybe for background on a certain procurement and any documents to support the procurement. Again, I'm all, that's something that I did quite a bit of. And they wanted to know maybe, what informed the decision-making process. Was there any conflict of interest? What did we do to avoid conflict of interest? And I'm still talking about procurement, y'all. They wanted to have our policies and procedures, which we, of course, prepared and always had at the ready, and we would update sometimes throughout the year. So by the way, this is not just my practice. Many of these things were in place by the time I went into that position. So I do want to make it clear that these aren't things that I came in and just made wonderful. A lot of these things were in place. My job was to continue what was in place and enhance it. And yes, I did put some enhancements in place. So just want to make sure that I level set on that. So again, this is why I talk all the time about supporting documents, because again, I was that girl that killed a tree preparing those really thick reimbursement requests every single month. And, I would take them sometimes in those very same boxes that the paper came in, those, the boxes with the paper, reams of paper used to come in. I used to have to take, 4 copies to this agency, literally drive it to the agency, another copy to this agency. So I used to drive them around once a month. I was a part-time government grant manager for a nonprofit here in Atlanta. And that's how they would get their reimbursements, right? I would prepare them, I would have to deliver them, and then we would get sometimes a check, sometimes an ACH payment. So, just providing, again, some insight into from where I cometh. Again, I know quite a bit about, documents that adequately support what costs. Of course, things change. I haven't done that in some time in my current role as CEO at GrantWin, but it's something that I speak about all the time. Again, it's just probably embedded in me for now. Again, speaking of supporting documents, don't forget you can grab a copy of our supporting documentation and cost allowability primer for federal grantees. It is not, again, to be confused with an in-depth checklist with basically the same name. However, to access that checklist, registrants of the Federal Grant IQ training series, they get access to that particular checklist. It's one of the 3 pretty cool tools that they get to download and use to help them with managing their federal grants. This is something you can get if you are using the self-directed approach, right? If you decide to train yourself, or if our company comes in and provides training to your team, we bring copies of, certain things. Some of the activities that we do are in one of those downloadables, which is an 88-page compendium, so to speak, or a training resource that accompanies the training to really reinforce what we're teaching in the videos themselves. So part of the reason I decided to dive into this topic is because we're hosting an upcoming cohort about an important first step in preparing for a single audit, and that is preparing an accurate CFA. And a CFA is the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. That's what the CFA is, and that is a document where you're listing basically all of the expenditures for the federal awards that your organization had, whether you had them as a subrecipient or as a primary recipient. And there are quite a few details that you have to put on that CFA. And the CFA accuracy is very, very, very important. I remember actually being asked by the director of finance at my first government grant management job to confirm the accuracy of the details that they had on the CFA. And that's when I learned, okay, well, this is something we prepare for auditors. And guys, this is way back in the, I don't remember. It was a long time ago. And obviously it was called an A133 audit back then, but it was definitely, I do remember having to at least verify that information, not prepare it, because that wasn't my expertise, but to verify the accuracy of, the CFDA numbers, the, funds utilized, actual expenses, not the awarded amount, and some of the other details that were on the CFA that I was asked to verify. So the cohort will be from May 14th, 2026 to June 4th, 2026. It will be led by Patrice Nelson. She and I are not related, even though she's also a Patrice. She's a grant accountant, internal auditor, and financial consultant. She specializes in grant compliance, financial management system design, and much more. Expertise that's related to this particular topic. To learn more about the cohort and about Patrice and her experience, I have the link below in the video description if you're watching me on YouTube, and in the episode description if you happen to be listening to me on your favorite streaming service. By the way, we're just about to finish up our first cohort. I'm the one leading and facilitating that. It's been an absolutely wonderful experience. I can't tell you how fantastic it's been. Cohort participants have created new or modified subrecipient risk questionnaires. They've developed new tools to assist in risk assessment. A new set of subrecipient monitoring policies and procedures. One participant never had one, and now they have one. A subrecipient monitoring checklist. And during tomorrow's session, which is session 7 of the 8 sessions, we'll dive into site visits. So we're going to really take a deep dive into that and make sure they have the resources that they need the next time their organization decides to undertake a site visit. So back to our episode about single audits. So I'm going to show now a very brief video with some examples of single audit findings. So, you may be wondering, okay, what is a finding? When an independent auditor conducts a single audit of your organization's oversight of its federal grants and cooperative agreements, they sometimes identify what are called findings. A single audit finding is a, quote, formal deficiency identified by auditors regarding an organization's compliance with federal program regulations or internal controls over federal spending. They identify issues such as question costs, improper documentation, or non-compliance, and they typically require a formal corrective action plan. So by the way, you can learn more about single audits. As I mentioned before, I decided not to take a deep dive into the regulatory requirements for this episode, but you can, if you'd like. You can go to 2 CFR 200, section 500 to 507, and you can learn more about, the auditee's responsibilities, the auditor's responsibilities, and much, much more. Again, that's 2 CFR 200, section 500 to 507. Hey there, FGE viewers and listeners. I wanted to briefly go through a state's single audit report. So this is a state, basically it's their fiscal year 2024 single audit. And I'm in the section of the audit report called the Schedule of Findings and Question Costs. And that's where you're going to find, of course, the findings. So I'm going to start with this first finding, and this is a finding related to subrecipient monitoring, specifically around eligibility. They didn't outline any questions cost here, but, just wanted to give you some examples of some of the, the in-depth analysis that is done sometimes during a single audit. So, for example, they randomly select records, and they were able to identify, at least for 2 of the 3 that there were some issues around the subrecipient's ability to follow through and double checking on the eligibility of program participants. And, an annual inventory wasn't performed in some instances. And then once they identify all of these, the effect, and they lay out exactly what the regulatory requirements are, they then, of course, provide a recommendation, and the management, of the audited organization can provide a comment. And in this case, they basically said that they concur and that they're going to make these modifications to their monitoring process. So wanted to show you that one. And the other one, which I hope you can see, is another one related to period of performance. And quite frankly, guys, I remember I used to see this quite a bit when we used to conduct monitoring visits. And what does that mean? That means that the period of performance of a grant, let's say it's July 1st, 2025 through June 30th, 2028. Right? So July 1st, 2025, June 30th, 2028. That means there should not be any expenses charged to that grant before July 1st, 2025, unless something that's called pre-award costs are approved by the agency or allowed by the agency. And so whenever you see those things around period of performance, that immediately tells me that costs are being charged to the grant outside of the period of performance. So again, I'm not going to take a deep dive in here because I really don't want to make it seem as if, there was anything crazy going on here. I just will provide you an overview. This particular auditor, they lay out the background, of course, the prior audit results, condition and cause, criteria, effect, and of course the recommendation, it says that you should develop internal controls, effective control procedures to ensure expenditures occurred during the grant's awards period of performance, and you should carefully evaluate and update the risk assessment. So that tells me quite a bit, because if you are in the finance or an accounting department and you start charging costs, allocating costs to a grant outside of the period of performance, either you were, incorrect information about the period of performance was communicated to you, and so you thought it was okay, number one, or number two, I don't want to make assumptions. There may be some training things that need to happen there around, ensuring that you are very clear on the period of performance before you start allocating costs to a grant. So, I will just, keep moving on. I just wanted to show you guys some of the findings. And then this is another one around period of performance. I think this is, quite a few I've seen in this report. I'll say 3 or 4. There may be more. I didn't look at every single page. And here's another one around, let's see here. This is around subrecipient monitoring, significant deficiency and non-compliance. And there's our friend, the Child and Adult Care Food Program. And we talked about this in the last episode, the Feeding Our Future program. Remember that grant program was the Child and Adult Care Food Program and the Summer Food Service Program. This is a program that requires, really in-depth monitoring like many others do. But just wanted to point that out. I am going to look to see, I didn't look ahead of time, what so no management decisions issued, risk assessment, effect, bear with me here, the recommendation, management should implement effective controls to address the risks noted in this finding. I mean, they go on, and I'm not going to detail that, but in each instance, the state agency, well, I wouldn't say each, but at least in these 2 instances, they concurred with, the auditor's findings. So that's it. Just wanted to give you an idea of, what some of these findings look like in an audit report, a single audit report. Again, the episode that I'm doing is not on all the things that an organization needs to know about a single audit. It's just an overview to kind of pull some things together. We do have training on, everything from A to Z on being audit ready. And again, this episode was just meant to kind of provide an overview and make a point about how effective federal grant management can help an organization become single audit ready. All right. So now we're going to talk about some of the mistakes that can lead to findings. And some of this is, these are just some of the things that I know, having worked with different types of organizations, that mistakes happen. And sometimes those mistakes are caused by, maybe not enough collaboration within an organization, or, again, there's staff turnover and you don't know where things were left off. There's quite a few things, but I'm going to go ahead and lay out some of those mistakes now. So number one, it could be CFA mistakes. We just already talked about the CFA. Again, it's the Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards. Reporting deficiencies, such as, not having sufficient cost match oversight, cost match tracking. I've seen that. And I have some experience with, grantees sometimes, sometimes not valuing or placing enough value on the importance of cost match or cost share tracking. I would say definitely another mistake is poor documentation, meaning they're not documenting eligibility of the beneficiaries of the federal grant. They're not documenting costs. And so that's also certainly a mistake. Expense approvals. So they're sometimes approving expenses based on insufficient or improperly documented expenses, not having a procurement policy, or one that is, 20 years old and is not, updated and certainly does not reflect whatever the process is. And that process is probably going to be a little scattered if the procurement policy is old, and maybe something, I'm not sure how that works when there aren't updated policies and procedures around something that requires so many touch points, such as procurement. Another mistake is inadequate subrecipient monitoring, or non-existent. And so that is, those are just some mistakes that can lead to findings. Now, what about findings that lead to corrective actions? So here's a list that I've prepared for a separate audience. And so those findings that lead to corrective actions are weak internal controls, insufficient documentation, non-compliance with program requirements and federal regulatory requirements in general, financial statement errors, inadequate subrecipient monitoring, incorrect accounting, and process and procurement issues. So again, those are just some of the findings that could lead to corrective actions. Okay. Hi, this is Patrice Davis, the host of the Federal Grants Explained podcast, and I'm having to re-record the ending of our last episode about preparing for your organization's single audit by having an accurate and ready to go SEFA. Again, that is the Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards. That's what SEFA stands for. I am actually visiting a family member, so I am not in my office right now. But of course, the show must go on. I needed to make sure that I recorded the very end of the episode to make sure that we are able to, of course, talk about those root causes, right? That's very important. And to talk about some strategies to avoid, not being prepared for your single audit. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that. And I do want to remind you that a lot of what we're going to be sharing in the root causes and strategies section of this episode are taken from, a presentation that I did at the 2025 Grant Professionals Association Grant Summit in, again, November 2025. I was a session speaker. And the name of the presentation was about avoiding audit anxiety by being prepared. Being a prepared auditee involves being an effective federal grant manager. So if you're an effective federal grant manager, your team and everyone's on the same page, and there's accountability across the board, there's documentation, everyone respects the process, there are internal controls in place, then you're going to be very prepared for a single audit. But let's go ahead and talk a bit about those root causes. So some of those root causes are not having a post-award planning, system in place. So, once you receive the awards, one of the things you may want to consider is, everyone sitting, everyone meeting all of the important stakeholders, program, and some of the other folks program, definitely finance and or accounting, and some other folks come to the table to talk about exactly what the award requires and, exactly who's going to be doing what. Just really having a strong planning system in place and making sure there is accountability, built into that process. Another root cause I recommend that you all address is not having, clearly defined roles. So once you clarify those roles, who will do what, when, that certainly adds to making sure everyone's clear about, who's going to be making sure that that all the costs charged to the grant are allowable, allocable, and reasonable and budgeted. Who's going to be the one that makes sure that, and this is assuming there is no grant manager on the team. So I've actually, partnered with organizations, or I'm aware of organizations that receive hundreds of millions of dollars in grants, and they have no grant department. That's because, again, as I started, and you guys have heard me talk about this numerous times, they are allowing the grants to be managed by the program team. And so, there may be different types of setup in place where the program team, maybe they have a grant manager on their team. But I've actually asked, and in most instances, there is no grant management team. So when there is no grant manager or team in place, and you have the standard finance program, maybe legal, even data folks, and no one's really coordinating that process, if there's no clarity on who's going to be managing it across those 4 different entities or 4 different, let's call them bodies or divisions within the organization, then that sometimes can introduce challenges. And then there's also inadequate or no accountability. So that is also a root cause that can lead to challenges. And I guess that's also tied to having ill-defined roles. But sometimes you can have actually very clearly defined roles and still not have the accountability that's needed, or have inadequate accountability, to make sure that everyone's very clear about making sure that they hold up their end of the bargain, so to speak. Another one is weak collaboration. And as you can see, all of this is all based on systems, right? This is why we at GrantWin always speak about making sure that the grant management that we effectuate or the grant management that we implement for our clients are systems based. As I always, it's a joke, but it's, sometimes this happens. I always say you get the award, you don't hand it off to the one accounting coordinator and have him or her be the person responsible for your federal and other government grants. You have to approach this systemically, and and even systematically, and that's part of the reason why. That's how we, make sure that's how we build this into our engagement with our clients. As a matter of fact, we have a method called the STAC method. And the STAC method, the S part of STAC means systemizing, right? So we believe in systemizing federal grant management. And this is a method that I created, and this is the method that we use for all of our post-award management engagements. We apply that, ASTAC method into our process, and that's what makes us effective at what we do. But going back to weak collaboration, no accountability, ill-defined roles, no post-award planning or systems are all tied or all, representative of not having a systems-based approach to managing your grants. And another thing I want to point out here is inadequate processes and tools. Again, it goes back to, not approaching federal grants as something that you need to manage as a project, and that involves integrating a number of let me see, how would I describe this? A number of contacts within the organization. And one of the ways that you do that is ensuring that there's certain processes in place, certain tools that are utilized by different people. And so if there are inadequate processes and tools, that will also lead to being, not as ready as you should be for a single audit, and certainly not being able to have an accurate CFA if things are, done haphazardly, or without the, proper collaboration and accountability and clarity on those roles. And the final thing that I have on here in terms of a root cause that I recommend that you all address is inadequate or missing inadequate policies and procedures. So that is something that's very, very important. As a matter of fact, it's required. If you have a federal grant, you must have grant management policies and procedures in place. And some organizations have them, but they represent activities and processes that they had in place before they had a federal grant. And they never bothered to update it, right? Or maybe they didn't have, ample time. They didn't have enough resources. They didn't have the capacity or the capability. So I'm very, very aware that, these kinds of challenges exist. And, not having adequate policies and procedures is absolutely one of the root causes of, inaccurate CFAs and being just generally ill prepared for a single audit. All right, so we've talked about some of the root causes. We're going to round this all out by talking about some ways that you can actually address it, right? So we're not just going to focus on what the challenges are. We're going to focus on some solutions. And so one of the first solutions is, of course, is to have strong internal controls. And I throw those words out a lot. And I think I've shared this before. We used to host monthly webinars. So all of 2025, we hosted a monthly webinar. And for the latter half of 2024, we had monthly webinars. Prior to that, we did webinars maybe on a quarterly basis, maybe every 8 weeks or so. But we've hosted numerous webinars. And the one webinar, we were really surprised by the turnout. Was the webinar on internal controls, specifically internal controls and how they impact your federal grants, right? Because knowing what internal controls are is one thing, but how does that actually apply to your federal grants? And so really big turnout for that, lots of questions. And so I'm really, really happy, that the interest was there. People understood that this is something they needed to learn about. And we were there to provide, really detailed overview. And so, strong internal controls are very, very important. I would also say sufficient documentation. So, as I always say, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And so, adequate documentation is, it's a thing, right? You need to be able to adequately document costs that are being charged to federal grants. And the other, I would call it solution is, of course, is having a compliance focused, team, compliance focused initiatives, just being compliance focused in general. And there are ways to do that. So as I may have shared in 1 or 2 or 3 episodes, so my role in previous positions before I started Grants Works, which is now GrantWin, I used to serve as a senior director of federal grants compliance for a large nonprofit many of you are already aware of. I've served as a grant compliance officer for another nonprofit many of you are very aware of. I was their first grant compliance officer. And then I've operated in other grant compliance roles before, also being a research program manager for, a top research university. And, really being compliance focused is a key part of your role in, basically you're not just there to push paper, you're there also to champion compliance within the organization. And there are a lot of things that I now realize I could have done to be more effective in my role. Of course, I didn't go in having all the answers. No one ever does. And so I now know some things that I could have done. And these are some of the things that we teach in the GrantWin Grant Collective membership. It's a phased program, and I believe it's around phase 4 where we position you to be a federal grant strategist. And then that final phase, we then position to be a federal grant leader. So I've learned a lot over the years, and as a result, I've been able to really look at the big picture of what are some things that I could have done better as a leader in federal grant compliance. Of course, I was effective, did the work well. However, in terms of championing compliance and internal training, and just kind of generating more buy-in, I definitely could have done a better job. And but that all has to do with behavior change and building the right relationships and incentivizing your colleagues to collaborate and cooperate. Those are all the things that I definitely think I could have done better. But just wanted to point out that having a compliance-centered approach is really important. I would also say, of course, audit readiness is really focused on financial statement accuracy, making sure that your financial statements are as accurate as possible. Now, if you have subrecipients, I cannot stress the importance of making sure that you have adequate subrecipient monitoring in place. Well, first of all, you're required, right? You are required to monitor your subrecipients, and adequate monitoring, there's a way to determine what adequate is, what's adequate for a state agency with, let's say 100 subrecipients versus a nonprofit with 9 subrecipients. There may be a slight difference in what's adequate, but the monitoring requirement doesn't change. You do still have to monitor your subrecipients. It's just how you do it to make sure that you're as effective as possible. And so I'll leave that there. But yes, adequate subrecipient monitoring is a huge part of being audit ready if you are single audit eligible and you have subrecipients. And the 2 final things that an organization needs to do to make sure that they are audit ready, single audit ready specifically, is to make sure that, their accounting records are also accurate. Of course, that would tie into, making sure your financial statements are accurate, but definitely your accounting. So one of the things that one of my responsibilities in all of my grant compliance roles were reviewing, costs charged to, all of our federal grants and identifying costs that were not to be charged to the federal grants, and then making sure I partnered with the accounting team to make sure that those costs were reclassed, right? And then double checking those modified financial reports to make sure that those reclassed expenses were indeed removed, right? So that nothing was charged to the federal grant. And it's not just making sure that none of it was charged. There are some instances where some of those expenses can be partially allocated to a federal grant. And so we just needed to make sure that that allocation was correct, right? And that it was reasonable in those instances where reasonability needed to be evaluated. So just wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about my previous role and, of course, your role, if that is your role. If you are responsible for making sure your organization complies with this federal grants, that is your role. And then the final one I'll say here is process and procurement readiness, right? So procurement is a top, I would say specifically non-compliant procurement is a top audit finding. I recommend that you take a look at some of the single audit findings that are out there just to get an idea of just how many challenges seem to exist with procurement, grant-funded procurement specifically, so that you can think through what your process is internally. Of course, if you have procurement policies and procedures, then you would follow your policies and procedures. If your policies and procedures are out of date, or they are non-existent, or they are not aligned with federal requirements, then that is, a problem. And it kind of goes back to that root cause, that if you don't have the policies and procedures in place, then that align with federal requirements, then of course that can increase the chances of, the organization being non-compliant with its procurement efforts. So from here, I just wanted to round out the episode, provide some more insight into, again, making sure that those root causes you guys are more aware of those root causes, and we'll be able to, I would say recognize them and hopefully address them. And then of course, some of those strategies are some of the things that you can do to make sure you're as ready as possible for your next single audit. And of course, making sure that your CFA is ready to go. So this is where I'll end the episode, and I just want to take a few minutes to remind you a little bit about what GrantWin does. So GrantWin is a grant consulting and training firm based in Atlanta, Georgia, that supports our clients as they find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal and other government grants, as well as grants from foundations and corporations. So both public sector grants and private sector grants. We train your teams to manage their grants, help you identify compliance gaps through our compliance assessment service, monitor and modify award budgets as your grant management partner. We set up financial management systems as your financial consultant. We do have someone on our team, actually two people on our team that have worked with us as financial consultants, and that's exactly what they specialize in, and they've been doing it for years. We help you develop written policies and procedures, and of course become audit ready, right? So you can learn more about me in the summary below and about GrantWin in the details below. As a matter of fact, if you want to learn more about the GrantWin Grant Collective, that's our membership where you can learn all of this, and I'll be actually teaching people to become a grant manager. That's something that I've been thinking about for some time. But if you're a grant writer or you're someone who wants to enhance your grant management skills, I am going to be, sharing more about that in the collective every single month, tips on how to be a better grant manager. And I think what I'm also going to do is actually lead an in-person workshop on how to be a grant manager. This will be a one-day workshop. If you're interested, drop a comment in the chat. I'll be more than happy to follow up and give you more information when we announce it. But I absolutely been toying with this idea for a couple of years, and I'm finally ready to do it. So also please check out the links in the description to learn about GrantsWorks Academy, soon to be called GrantWin Academy, including the Federal Grant IQ training series, and of course the GrantWin Grant Collective, a membership that is, absolutely worth your time and efforts. So by the way, again, much of our training is accredited for CEUs or CPEs. So that's continuing education units or continuing professional education units by NASBA, which is National Association for the State Boards of Accountancy, CFRE, which is Certified Fundraising Executive, and GPCI, which is Grant Professional Certification Institute. So when you stick with us, learn from us, and actually we would learn from each other, you're not only learning more about the grant world, so to speak, but you get an opportunity to earn those really valuable CPEs or CEUs. So again, I'm Patrice Davis. Thanks for watching or listening to this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Until the next video, goodbye.